The wind had been a liar all morning. It whispered sweet nothings through the sparse pinon pines, a gentle caress against Sterling Maddox's dust-caked cheek, promising a calm day's ride to Willow Creek. But by noon, the whispers had grown teeth. The sky, a brilliant, endless blue just hours before, was now bruised with shades of slate and charcoal along the western horizon. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and damp earth, a scent that spoke of a violence the heavens were about to unleash. Sterling pulled his hat down, the brim casting a deeper shadow over his weary eyes. He was a man shaped by the land, lean, hard, and quiet. His face was a map of long trails and longer nights, tanned by a sun that showed no mercy and lined by winds that offered no comfort. He rode not with the swagger of a young gun looking for a name, but with the steady, bone-deep patience of a man who understood that the West was won not by the fastest draw, but by the one who could endure the most. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust, seemed to share his unease, its ears twitching, its steps growing shorter, more deliberate. Ahead, a flicker of civilization appeared, a smudge against the vast, unforgiving landscape. It was Silas Croft's trading post, the last stop before the treacherous climb through the Black Maw Canyon. It wasn't much a squat sod building that seemed to grow out of the earth itself, with a crooked porch and a plume of smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. But it meant hot coffee, a sack of grain for Dust, and perhaps a piece of news that wasn't 3 weeks old. He dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking in the loaded silence. The wind snatched at his coat, a cold, probing finger that promised worse to come. Tying Dust to the hitching post, he gave the horse a reassuring pat on the neck. "Won't be long, boy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. The inside of the post was dim and smelled of cured leather, tobacco, and dried herbs. Shelves overflowed with a chaotic assortment of goods, sacks of flour, barrels of pickles, bolts of calico, tins of coffee, and traps of every size. Silas Croft sat behind the counter, a mountain of a man with a wild, graying beard and eyes as shrewd as a hawk's. He was polishing a rifle with an oily rag, his movements slow and methodical. He looked up as Sterling entered, the small bell above the door announcing his arrival with a dull jingle. "Maddox." Silas grunted, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Thought that was you. You're either brave or a fool to be heading toward the canyon with that sky boiling up." Sterling moved toward the pot-bellied stove in the center of the room, holding his cold hands out to the warmth. A little of both. "I reckon. Low on coffee and the horses need shoeing in Willow Creek." "Horses can wait. The sky can't," Silas said, setting the rifle aside. He poured 2 cups of thick, black coffee into tin mugs and pushed one across the counter. "That's not a summer shower brewing. That's a real gully washer. Might even turn to sleet up in the high passes. You get caught in the maw, you'll be lucky if they find your bones come spring." Sterling took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter and hot, and it felt good. "I've weathered storms before." "Not like the ones that come through here," Silas insisted, leaning his heavy forearms on the counter. His voice dropped, taking on a conspiratorial tone. "This land, it gets angry, especially up in that canyon. It's got a memory, and it ain't a pleasant one." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "You'll be looking for shelter if you don't turn back. And there ain't much to be had, just one place, and I'd sooner sleep in a den of rattlers." Sterling raised an eyebrow. He was a practical man, not given to ghost stories or local superstitions. But Silas had been in these parts for 30 years. He knew the land and its secrets. "What place is that?" "An old cabin, tucked away in a box canyon that branches off the main trail. You can't miss it. It's got a red door, a bright, devilish red, like a smear of blood against the rock." "Someone living there?" Sterling asked. His interest piqued despite himself. Shelter was shelter, no matter the color of the door. Silas's expression soured. He picked up his rag and began wiping the already clean counter. "Living ain't the word I'd use. existing, maybe surviving. There's a girl there, an Apache girl. Been there for years, all alone. The trader's tone was laden with a mixture of pity and distaste. In this part of the country, an Apache living alone on the edge of settler territory was more than an anomaly. It was a problem waiting to happen. Folks say she's bad medicine, Silas continued, his voice barely a whisper. Cursed. Her own people cast her out when she was just a girl, and the folks from the settlement down the way. They want nothing to do with her. Say she brings ill fortune. What kind of ill fortune? Sterling asked, taking another swallow of coffee. The quiet kind, the kind that gets under your skin. A man from the mining camp went up there a year back, full of whiskey and bad intentions. He came back 2 days later, pale as a ghost. Wouldn't say a word about what happened. Just packed his mule and rode east, never to be seen again. Another fella, a trapper, lost his way in a blizzard and holed up with her. When he came down, he told everyone she'd put thoughts in his head, made him see things from his past he'd spent a lifetime trying to forget. Said her eyes looked right through him and pulled out all the rot he had buried inside. Silas shook his head slowly, his gaze distant. His wife had left him years before. He claimed the Apache girl made him see his wife's face, crying, just like the day he'd struck her. He started drinking heavy after that, found him in a ditch a month later, frozen solid. Sterling remained silent, processing the story. It sounded like the ramblings of a guilty conscience amplified by isolation and cheap liquor. A lonely woman in a remote cabin was an easy target for blame, a canvas on which desperate men could paint their own demons. So they call her cursed because a drunk saw a ghost, Sterling said, his skepticism plain in his voice. They call her cursed because trouble follows her like a shadow, Silas countered, his voice firm. Crops fail downriver. Cattle get sick. A child took ill in the settlement, and the mother swore she saw the Apache girl walking the ridge line the night before, talking to the moon. They say she doesn't age. They say she can call the storms. He gestured with his thumb toward the darkening windows. Like this one. Sterling finished his coffee and placed the mug on the counter. Sounds like a lot of campfire talk to me. A convenient person to blame when things go wrong. Maybe, Silas conceded, his shoulders slumping slightly. But there's a reason no one goes up there. There's a reason that red door stays shut. I'm just telling you. Maddox, if that storm pins you down, and you see that cabin, maybe the wind and the rain are the safer company. Some folks are better left alone. Some places are better left unseen. Sterling bought his supplies, nodding a silent thanks to Silas. The warning lingered in his mind. Unsettling not because he believed it, but because of the conviction in the trader's eyes. It was the fear of the unknown. The fear of a woman who didn't fit into the neat, brutal categories of their world. She was not a settler's wife, nor a saloon girl, nor a victim of a raid. She was simply other. And in the West, what was other was dangerous. He stepped back outside into a world that had transformed. The wind was a physical force now, a howling beast that tore at his clothes and threw dust into his eyes. The sky was a churning cauldron of black and purple clouds, so low they seemed to snag on the mountaintops. The first drops of rain began to fall, not a gentle sprinkle, but fat, cold splatters that hit the dry ground with audible thuds. There was no turning back. The storm was coming from the west, the direction he had come from. His only chance was to push forward, to try and outrun the worst of it through the canyon. He swung himself onto Dust's back and urged the horse into a trot, leaning low against the wind. Within minutes, the trot became a walk, and the rain became a deluge. It came down in solid, blinding sheets, turning the trail into a slick, treacherous river of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to split the very rock around them. It wasn't a rumble, it was a physical blow, vibrating through the saddle, through Sterling's bones, making Dust shy and rear in terror. He fought to control the horse, his voice a soothing murmur against the storm's roar. They were at the mouth of Black Maw Canyon now, and the name had never seemed more appropriate. The towering rock walls on either side amplified the wind's shriek, creating a terrifying symphony of natural fury. The temperature plummeted, and the rain began to mix with ice, stinging his face like 1,000 tiny needles. This was what Silas had warned him about. Not a storm, but a living, breathing entity of pure rage. He was a fool to have thought he could ride through it. Water cascaded down the canyon walls, forming instant waterfalls that crashed onto the trail. Rocks, dislodged by the torrent, tumbled down from the heights, splashing into the mud nearby with sickening thuds. He had to find shelter, now. He scanned the canyon walls, his eyes straining against the gray curtain of rain and sleet. He remembered Silas's words, a box canyon branching off the main trail. He urged Dust forward, the horse slipping and sliding, its breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. Every muscle in Sterling's body was tense, every nerve on high alert. He was no longer a cowboy on a journey. He was a creature seeking refuge, reduced to the most primal of instincts. Then he saw it. To his right, a narrow opening he would have otherwise missed, a sliver in the rock, just wide enough for a horse and rider. It was a gamble. It could be a dead end, a trap, but staying on the main trail was certain death. With a prayer on his lips he didn't know he had, he guided Dust into the opening. The wind lessened almost immediately, baffled by the tight rock walls. They were in a small, circular canyon, a pocket of relative calm in the heart of the tempest. And there, at the far end, nestled against the sheer cliff face as if it had grown there, was a cabin. It was small and sturdy, built of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney from which no smoke rose, and it had a red door. It wasn't just red. It was a defiant, impossible red, a color that had no business being in this world of brown rock and gray sky. It was the red of a fresh wound, the red of a dying sunset. It was exactly as Silas had described it, a silent, screaming warning. For a long moment, Sterling just sat there on his horse, soaked to the skin, shivering uncontrollably. The trader's stories swirled in his mind, the cursed girl, the ghosts of the past, the bad medicine. Every instinct for self-preservation, honed over years of solitude on the trail, told him to turn around, to take his chances with the storm. The known danger of the flood and the falling rocks seemed almost preferable to the unknown danger behind that door. But then Dust shuddered beneath him, a full-body tremor of exhaustion and cold. Sterling looked at his own hands on the reins. They were blue and stiff. Hypothermia was not a superstition. It was a cold, hard fact. He could feel it creeping into his bones, dulling his thoughts. He wouldn't last another hour out here. The storm had made his choice for him. He was a man who believed in what he could see and touch the heft of a gun, the warmth of a fire, the solidity of the ground beneath his feet. A girl in a cabin was just a girl in a cabin. The stories were just stories. With a resolve born of pure necessity, he nudged Dust forward, the horse's hooves sinking into the muddy ground. He stopped a few yards from the cabin, dismounted on stiff, unsteady legs, and walked toward the splash of crimson that promised either salvation or a different kind of doom. The wind howled outside the box canyon, a mournful cry, as Sterling Maddox raised his cold, numb fist and knocked on the red door. The sound of his knuckles against the thick wood was swallowed by the storm. For a moment, Sterling wondered if he'd imagined it, if his frozen hand had even made contact. He knocked again, harder this time. The sharp raps a desperate plea against the roaring chaos of the wind and rain. He waited, water streaming from the brim of his hat and down his neck, a cold that had settled deep into his marrow. Nothing. The red door remained as silent and impassive as a tombstone. Perhaps Silas was right. Perhaps no one was home. Or perhaps whoever was inside had no intention of opening their door to a stranger, especially not on a night when the devil himself seemed to be riding the wind. He was about to turn away, to lead Dust to the slight overhang of the cliff for what little protection it might offer. when he heard it, a faint scraping sound from within, the sound of a heavy bar being lifted from its bracket. He held his breath. The door didn't swing open. It moved inward by a fraction, then a little more, until a gap of no more than 3 inches appeared. The space was filled with a profound darkness, an absolute black that seemed to drink the already failing light. Sterling could see nothing, but he could feel the weight of a gaze upon him, a gaze that was sharp, assessing, and utterly devoid of welcome. He cleared his throat, his voice coming out as a rough croak. "Ma'am, I got caught in the storm. My horse is spent. I'm just looking for a place to get out of the wind. I mean no harm." Silence was his only answer. The gaze intensified. He could feel it probing, searching for the lie in his words, the threat in his posture. He slowly raised his hands, palms open, showing they were empty. It was a gesture of surrender, a sign he was a man in need, not a man looking for trouble. "Please," he added, the word torn from him by a violent shiver that racked his entire body. "Just until it passes." From the darkness, a hand emerged into the sliver of light. It was a small hand, slender and brown, but it was not empty. It held a knife. The blade was long and honed to a wicked edge, the kind used for skinning game, and it glinted with a cold, blue light. The hand held it with an absolute stillness that was more menacing than any threat. It was not a weapon she had just picked up. It was a weapon she lived with. Then the face behind the hand moved forward, just enough to be seen. It was a young woman, though the harshness in her eyes made her age impossible to guess. Her face was all sharp angles and stark beauty, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. Her hair was as black as a raven's wing, pulled back tightly from her face, emphasizing the intensity of her stare. But it was her eyes that held him. They were the color of dark, wet earth after a storm, and they were filled with a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. There was fear, yes, the deep, ingrained fear of a cornered animal, but beneath it, burning with a cold fire, was a fierce and profound anger. It was the anger of someone who had been trespassed against too many times, who had learned that the only shield was to strike first. She studied him for what felt like an eternity. Her eyes moved over him, from his drenched hat to his worn boots, lingering on his face. He felt stripped bare, as if she could see not just the cold and the exhaustion, but every mile he had ever ridden, every regret he carried. The stories from the trading post flickered in his mind that she could pull the rot from a man's soul. He pushed the thought away. He was just a cold man, and she was just a woman with a knife, and the storm was real. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and quiet, yet it cut through the sound of the wind with an unnerving clarity. It was a voice that hadn't been used for conversation in a long time, carrying the slight rasp of disuse. "Men come here for 2 reasons, she said, her English precise, almost formal. To take something, or to leave their trouble behind. Which are you?" Sterling was taken aback by the directness of the question. There was no room for evasion. "Neither. Ma'am, I'm just a man trying not to freeze to death. My name is Sterling Maddox. I'm a cowboy, running a few head of cattle over in the Blue Hills. I was on my way to Willow Creek." He offered his name and his story as a token of peace, a piece of himself to show he was not a phantom or a threat. She gave no sign that she had heard him, or if she had, that it mattered. Her dark eyes remained fixed on his. "The storm will pass," she said. It was not a promise of comfort, but a statement of fact, a dismissal. "It might pass over my dead body if I stay out here," he countered, his desperation making him bold. "I have coffee and some dried meat in my saddlebags. I'm not asking for your charity, just for a piece of your floor, by the fire." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, indecision. Perhaps. She glanced past him, into the maelstrom of the canyon, at the sheets of rain and ice that hammered the earth. She could see his horse, Dust, standing with its head hung low, a miserable, half-drowned creature. The horse was proof of his story. No man would willingly subject his mount to this. She looked back at him, her gaze as sharp as the point of her blade. He was an intruder, a danger, a man, and men were the source of all the pain she had ever known. But to leave him outside was to condemn him, and whatever life had made her, it had not yet made her a killer. "There are rules," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any warmth. The door opened another few inches. Sterling felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. "Any rules, you say? You will bring your saddle. Your weapons stay with it, by the door. You will not come near me. You will not speak to me unless I speak to you first. You will not look at me." The last rule hung in the air between them. Not look at her. It was a strange, almost impossible demand. "You will not ask questions," she continued, her voice a relentless, low monotone. "You will not ask my name. You will not ask why I am here. You will not ask about this cabin or anything in it. You will be a stone in the corner of this room, and when the first light of morning comes, and the rain has stopped, you will be gone." Each condition was a brick in a wall she was building between them, a wall of silence and invisibility. He was being offered shelter not as a guest, but as an object, a piece of driftwood washed in by the storm that would be gone with the morning tide. "I understand," Sterling said, his voice hoarse. "I swear it." She held his gaze for another long second, and then, with a reluctant slowness, she pulled the door open just wide enough for him to slip through. He stumbled inside, his body screaming in protest as it met the shocking warmth of the cabin. The door shut behind him with a solid, final thud, and he heard the heavy bars slide back into place. The sound echoed in the small space, a declaration of imprisonment as much as one of safety. The cabin was a single room, larger than it looked from the outside, but spare. The air was dry and smelled of wood smoke, cedar and something else, a faint, clean scent of wild herbs. A small, well-tended fire burned in a stone hearth at the far end of the room, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the log walls. The light was dim, but it was enough to see by. The space was meticulously clean and orderly. A narrow cot covered with a thick fur blanket was pushed against one wall. A rough-hewn table with a single stool stood in the center. Shelves carved directly into the log walls held a few clay pots, some bundles of dried plants, and a small stack of what looked like worn, leather-bound books. There were no personal trinkets, no decorations, nothing to speak of the person who lived here, save for a single eagle feather tucked into a crack in the logs above the hearth. It was a place of austere survival, a fortress built for one. The girl, Nayeli, though he did not know her name, had retreated to the far side of the fire, putting the hearth between them. She moved with a silent, fluid grace, her back to the wall, never letting him out of her sight. The knife was no longer pointed at him, but she held it down by her side, the blade resting against her leather-clad leg. It was an extension of her arm, a permanent part of her. Sterling stood dripping by the door, acutely aware of his intrusion. He was a wet, dirty stain on her clean, ordered world, heeding her instructions. He unbuckled his gun belt, the heavy Colt and the leather creaking in the silence. He laid it carefully on top of his saddle, which he had placed on the floor just inside the door. He felt naked without the weight of the gun on his hip, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. He took off his soaked hat and coat, laying them beside the saddle. He kept his back to her as much as he could, trying to make himself small and non-threatening. He was painfully aware of her presence, of her eyes on him. He could feel her watching his every move, waiting for him to break one of her brittle rules. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. It was heavier and more profound than the silence of the open prairie. Outside, the storm raged, its fury a constant, distant roar. But inside, the only sounds were the soft crackle and hiss of the fire and the unsteady rhythm of his own breathing. He did not dare look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the floorboards, on the fire, on anything but the woman who was the sole inhabitant of this lonely, defiant world. He edged over to a spot on the wall farthest from both her and the door, sinking down to the floor with a weary sigh. His muscles ached, and the warmth of the room was making the cold in his bones feel like a physical pain. He was a guest in a stranger's house, yet he had never felt more alone. He was a stone in the corner, just as she'd demanded. He closed his eyes, listening to the fire and the storm, and wondered what kind of life, what kind of pain, could forge a woman to be as hard and as sharp as the knife she held in her hand. The red door was closed, and he was inside with the curse of the canyon, and for the first time, he felt a fear that had nothing to do with the weather. Hours passed in a silence that was more like a held breath. Sterling remained in his corner. A man turned to stone as commanded, but his mind was far from still. The initial, desperate need for warmth had subsided, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and a growing, gnawing awareness of his surroundings. He had broken her most important rule without moving a muscle. He was looking, not directly, never at her, but his senses were taking in every detail of the small, sparse world she had built against the wilderness. He saw the way the firelight caught the smooth, worn texture of the wooden spoon she used to stir a small pot hanging over the flames. He saw the precise, economical way she moved, a lifetime of solitude etched into her very posture. There were no wasted steps, no hesitant gestures. She knew the location of every object in the cabin to the inch, the way a blind man knows the feel of his own home. This was not a temporary refuge. It was a universe of one. He noted the lack of any personal items, save for the single eagle feather. No faded portraits, no small carvings, no mementos. It was a life stripped down to its barest essentials: shelter, warmth, sustenance. The orderliness was not just tidiness. It was a defense against chaos, a way of imposing control on a life that had clearly been robbed of it. The realization settled on him slowly, a cold weight in his gut. This woman hadn't been alone for a season or two. She had been alone for years. A very long time. The scent of something savory began to fill the cabin. A simple, earthy aroma of herbs and perhaps some kind of root vegetable simmering in the pot. It mingled with the smell of his own damp wool and leather. A stark contrast between her world and his. Hunger, a dull ache he had been ignoring, sharpened into a pang. He reached for his saddlebags, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. He pulled out a piece of dried beef and a hard biscuit. The sound of him chewing seemed deafeningly loud in the oppressive quiet. He ate slowly, his eyes on the fire. He could feel her watching him, though he did not look up to confirm it. Her presence was a constant pressure at the edge of his perception. He was an anomaly in her world, a disruption to a routine that was likely as old as his own weariness. He wondered what she must think, seeing a strange, half-frozen man invade her sanctuary. He represented the very world that had, by all accounts, pushed her out here to wither alone. When he finished his meager meal, a profound sense of injustice began to stir in him. Silas had said her own people had cast her out, and the settlers feared her. She was a woman caught between two worlds, belonging to neither, an outcast twice over. What could a person do to earn such a fate? He risked a glance in her direction, not at her face, but at her hands as she lifted the pot from the fire. They were steady, capable hands. She poured the steaming broth into a simple wooden bowl. Then she did something that stunned him. She walked across the room, her footsteps making no sound on the packed earth floor, and placed the bowl on the floor a few feet away from him. She said nothing. She simply set it down and retreated back to the far side of the hearth, her knife still held loosely in her hand. Sterling stared at the bowl. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of warmth and life. It was an offering, a truce, perhaps, or maybe just a practical act to ensure the strange man in her cabin didn't starve to death and become a bigger problem. Whatever the reason, it was the first crack in the wall of ice she had built around herself. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes fixed on the flames. He picked up the bowl. The warmth seeped into his cold hands, a feeling so welcome it was almost painful. He took a tentative sip. The broth was simple but nourishing, flavored with wild herbs he couldn't name. It was the taste of the earth, of this very canyon. It was the most human thing he had experienced in what felt like a lifetime. He drank it slowly, making it last. When he was done, he set the empty bowl down beside him. The simple act of sharing food, even in this strained and silent manner, had changed the atmosphere in the room. The silence was still there, but it was no longer hostile. It was now a shared space, filled with unspoken questions. He decided to risk breaking another rule. He would not ask a question, but he would make a statement, an observation. "You've lived here a long time," he said quietly, his voice pitched to be heard over the dying howl of the wind. She was silent for so long he thought she would not answer, that he had crossed a line and the wall would go back up, thicker than before. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low murmur, almost part of the fire's crackle. "What do you see, Cowboy?" It was not the answer he expected. It was a question thrown back at him, a challenge. She was asking what conclusions he, the intruder, had drawn from the scant evidence of her life. He thought for a moment, choosing his words with care. "I see someone who knows how to survive. Someone who's had to—" He paused. "And someone who's been left alone." A faint, bitter smile touched her lips, a fleeting expression of pain that was gone as quickly as it appeared. Alone is a clean place. People are not. "The trader in the valley, Silas Croft," Sterling began, watching the fire. "He told me about this cabin. He told me about you." He felt her stiffen. "And what stories does the white man tell now?" she asked. A new edge to her voice, sharp and cold. "That I sour the milk, that I call the storms with my wickedness." "Something like that," Sterling admitted. "He said you were cursed. He said, you make men see things they don't want to see." He had said it. He had put the superstition into the air between them. He expected anger, denial. Instead, he was met with a weary, profound sadness that seemed to emanate from her like heat from the fire. She finally turned her head and looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. Her eyes were deep and held a sorrow that seemed ancient. The anger and fear were still there, but they were shadows behind the grief. "I don't make them see anything," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Nothing that isn't already there. I am just a mirror." Sterling frowned, not understanding. "A mirror." "People carry their lives around with them," she explained, her gaze becoming distant, as if she were looking through him, into the past, all the dark corners, the regrets, the things they did in the night and hoped the morning would forget, the cruel words they can't take back, the promises they broke. They build walls around it, bury it deep. They smile and talk and pretend it isn't there. But it is. It's always there, sitting in the quiet parts of their heart, rotting. Her words were hypnotic, imbued with a quiet, terrible truth. Sterling thought of his own regrets, the face of his younger brother the day he rode away from the family farm, the unspoken words that now lay buried under 6 feet of Texas soil. "Most people can't see the rot in others," she continued. "They only see the walls. But I see the cracks. I have always been able to see them. When I look at someone, I don't just see their face. I see the ghosts that haunt them, the hungry ghosts of what they've done." She picked up a small stick and poked at the embers of the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "The trapper Silas told you about, the one who froze. He came here full of boasts, a big man with a loud laugh. But when he looked at me, he didn't see a woman. He saw his wife. He saw her face, bruised and crying, just as it was the last time he saw her before she ran away. He saw the cowardice in himself that made him raise his hand to her. He ran from this cabin not because of me, but because he could not bear to look at his own reflection. The story Silas had told, stripped of its superstitious fear, became a simple, ugly tragedy. "And your own people?" Sterling asked softly, forgetting the rule about questions. "Why would they leave you here?" Her expression hardened. A shadow passed over her face. "My people value strength. Honor. A warrior came to me once, a man everyone admired. He wanted what men often want. But when our eyes met, he flinched. He saw not a woman to be taken, but a moment in a battle years ago. A moment when his nerve broke, when he hid behind a rock while his cousin fell. No one ever knew, but he knew. And looking at me, he saw that I knew too. The shame was more than he could bear. It is easier to call a mirror a curse than to admit the face in it is your own. He told the elders I carried bad medicine, that I looked into a man's spirit and planted seeds of doubt and despair. It was easier for them to believe him, the great warrior, than to believe the quiet girl who saw too much." She fell silent, her story hanging in the small room, as real and as heavy as the stone hearth. She was not a witch. She was not cursed. She was just a woman with a terrible, lonely gift of perception. She saw the truth in people, and people could not bear the truth, so they had cast her out, white and Apache alike, leaving her in this canyon to be a repository for their fears and a scapegoat for their sins. "They abandoned you," Sterling said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "They protected themselves," she corrected him, her voice flat, "from what they did not want to understand." The storm outside had begun to quiet, its fury spent. The wind was now just a low moan. A sad song played through the rocks. The rain had softened to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. Sterling looked at this woman, this outcast, and felt a profound sense of respect. She had survived, surrounded by a world that feared and hated her. She had carved out a life in this desolate place, alone. She was not broken. She was wounded, deeply, but she was forged from something stronger than the ignorance that had tried to destroy her. She was like the canyon itself, weathered, scarred, but enduring. "What is your name?" he asked, the question soft, not a demand but a request. She looked at him for a long time, her dark eyes searching his face. He did not know what she saw there. Maybe she saw his own ghosts, his own lonely trails, or maybe, for the first time, she saw someone who was not afraid of what he saw in the mirror. "Nayeli," she said. The name was soft, like a whisper of wind through the pines. He repeated it in his mind. Nayeli. It was a beautiful name. It had the sound of endurance in it. He nodded slowly. "Nayeli," he said aloud, letting her know he had heard. "My name is Sterling." He had given her his name before, but this time was different. Before, it was the name of a stranger seeking shelter. Now, it was the name of a man who had been allowed to see a piece of her truth. A new silence fell between them, but this one was different from the ones that had come before. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of her story, and with the quiet beginning of a fragile, impossible understanding. The stone in the corner was no longer just a stone, and the woman by the fire was no longer just a curse. The sharing of her name, her true name, had fundamentally altered the space between them. Nayeli, Sterling. Two words that now held a weight they had not possessed an hour before. They were no longer just a cowboy and an outcast. They were two people, marooned by a storm, who had glimpsed the lonely truth of the other's existence. The wind outside had settled into a low, mournful sigh, and the rain was a steady, almost soothing drumbeat on the roof. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing orange embers, casting a soft, warm light that made the cabin feel less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary. The immediate life-or-death crisis of the storm had passed, leaving behind a different kind of intensity, a quiet, charged atmosphere that was both unnerving and strangely intimate. Sterling shifted, the movement stiff after sitting so long on the hard floor. Every muscle ached with cold and exhaustion. He knew he should try to sleep, to gather his strength for the ride ahead. But sleep felt impossible. He was too aware of Nayeli, who had not moved from her spot by the fire. She sat with her knees drawn up, the knife resting on the floor beside her, its blade still catching the faint light. She was staring into the embers. But he knew her focus wasn't there. It was turned inward, to the place where she had stored the story she had just unlocked for him. He felt a powerful urge to fill the silence, to say something that might ease the profound sadness that clung to her like a shroud. But what could he say? That he was sorry? The words were cheap, meaningless in the face of a lifetime of such profound isolation. He had learned on the trail that sometimes the best comfort you could offer a person was not words, but a quiet, steady presence. He rose slowly, his joints protesting, and walked to the hearth. He kept a respectful distance, but the move itself was a crossing of a boundary, a step out of his designated corner and into the shared space of the cabin. She tensed, her hand moving instinctively closer to the knife, but she did not tell him to go back. He picked up a log from the small pile beside the hearth, the wood dry and seasoned, and gently placed it on the embers. It caught quickly, and small flames began to lick at the bark, pushing back the shadows. "It's a good fire," he said, his voice low. "You keep your wood dry." It was a simple, practical observation, a cowboy's compliment, but it was an acknowledgement of her skill, her competence. It was an offering of normalcy in a situation that was anything but. Nayeli watched the new flames for a moment before she replied, her voice just as quiet. "The canyon gives you what you need, if you know how to look. And if you're strong enough to take it," Sterling added, thinking of the immense effort it must take to survive here, day in and day out, with only the rock and the wind for company. He settled back on the floor, but closer to the fire this time, creating a triangle between himself, Nayeli, and the flames. The invisible line that had divided the room was gone. They were now two people sharing the warmth, watching the same fire. He felt the need to give her something in return for the piece of her soul she had shared with him. "I had a brother," he said, the words coming out before he had fully considered them. He hadn't spoken of Jacob in years. "Younger than me, he saw things differently. Not like you do, but he saw the good in people, even when it wasn't there. He trusted everyone." Sterling's gaze grew distant, fixed on a memory playing out in the flames. That trust got him killed. A card game, a misunderstanding. "I wasn't there." He paused, the old guilt a familiar ache in his chest. "After that, I found it hard to trust anyone. The trail, it's an honest place. The horse, the sky, a rattlesnake. They don't lie about what they are. People are different. You were right. They are not clean." He hadn't meant to say so much, but in the quiet intimacy of the cabin, with this woman who saw the ghosts in others, his own felt closer to the surface. He was not just a cowboy. He was a man shaped by loss, a man who had chosen a life of solitude because it was safer than the messy, unpredictable world of other people. Nayeli turned her head, her dark eyes studying his face in the firelight. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he saw no fear, no anger. He saw a flicker of recognition, the quiet understanding of one lonely soul acknowledging another. Her gift, her curse, was to see the hidden wounds of others, but he had just shown her one of his, willingly. "The ghosts are heavy," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of shared truth. "Yes," he agreed, "they are." A comfortable silence fell between them. The barrier of her rules had dissolved, replaced by a fragile bridge of shared experience. He watched her, no longer afraid of breaking her command not to look. He saw the way a stray piece of her dark hair had fallen across her cheek. He saw the slight tremor in her hands that she tried to hide. She was not a myth or a monster. She was a woman, made of flesh and blood, and a resilience that humbled him. The fire warmed the room, and the steady heat began to lull him. His eyelids grew heavy. Nayeli must have seen his exhaustion, because she rose silently and went to her cot. She took the thick fur blanket that lay upon it, and for a moment he thought she was preparing to sleep, but instead she walked back toward him. She stopped a few feet away, holding the blanket out to him. It was another offering, like the broth, an act of care that went far beyond her initial, grudging grant of shelter. He reached out to take it, and as he did, his calloused fingers brushed against hers. The effect was instantaneous and electric. A sharp gasp of air escaped her lips, and she snatched her hand back as if she had been burned. The blanket fell to the floor between them. Her eyes widened, and the fear was back, raw and stark. But it was a different kind of fear now. It was not the fear of a man's violence, but the fear of a simple, gentle touch. He realized with a jolt that it was a sensation she likely hadn't felt in a decade or more. I'm sorry, he stammered, pulling his own hand back. She didn't answer. She stared at her hand, then at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her defenses, so carefully constructed over years of solitude, had been breached by the briefest, most accidental of contacts. She was like a person who had lived in darkness for so long that a single ray of light was blinding. She backed away slowly, retreating to the far side of the hearth, her safe space. The knife was back in her hand, but she wasn't holding it like a weapon. She was holding it like a talisman, a familiar object to cling to in a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar and frightening. Sterling's heart ached for her. He bent down and picked up the blanket. It was heavy and smelled faintly of wood smoke and the same wild herbs as the broth. He wrapped it around his shoulders, the warmth a small comfort against the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had broken the unspoken truce. He had reminded her that he was a man, that he had a physical presence, and in doing so, he had reminded her of a world of touch and contact that had long been denied to her, a world that had likely only ever brought her pain. He expected her to retreat back into silence, to rebuild the wall between them, but after several long minutes, she spoke, her voice strained, tight. "Why did you not run?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the fire. "When the traitor told you I was cursed, why did you still come here?" "Because the storm was a greater threat than a woman's story," he answered honestly. He paused, then added, "And because I've learned that the things people fear are often the things they don't understand. And do you understand now the question was a test? I understand that you've been alone for too long," he said gently. "I understand that people gave you their fear to carry because they were too weak to carry their own guilt." She absorbed his words, letting them settle. He could see the struggle in her face, the conflict between a lifetime of ingrained distrust and the hesitant, flickering hope that this man, this stranger, might actually be different. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the handle of her knife. It was her shield, her only constant companion. Slowly, deliberately, as if the movement caused her physical pain, she relaxed her grip. She placed the knife on the hearth beside her, not far, but no longer in her hand. It was the greatest act of trust he could imagine her making. A strange, powerful feeling welled up in Sterling's chest. It was a fierce, protective instinct, a desire to shield this woman from the world that had been so cruel to her. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to have for anyone in a very long time. He watched her as the night deepened, her posture slowly relaxing as the hours wore on. The tension in her shoulders eased, and she leaned her head back against the log wall, her eyes eventually closing. She didn't lie down, didn't fully surrender to sleep, but she rested, a small concession to the exhaustion he knew she must feel. He did not sleep. He sat awake, wrapped in her blanket, and kept watch. He was no longer a stone in the corner of her room. He was a guardian at the gate of her solitude, a witness to the fragile boundary between her painful past and the terrifying, uncertain possibility of a different future. The storm had brought him here, but it was something else entirely, something far more powerful and dangerous, that was keeping him here now, awake and watching, until the dawn. The first light of dawn was not a brilliant arrival, but a slow seeping of gray into the profound black of the night. It filtered through the single, grime-streaked window of the cabin, a pale, watery light that seemed as weary as the world it revealed. The rain had stopped. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic dripping of water from the eaves and the soft hiss of the last embers in the hearth. Sterling had not slept. He had dozed, his head resting against the rough-hewn logs, the heavy fur blanket a cocoon of borrowed warmth. He came to full awareness slowly, his senses taking in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The air was clean and cold, smelling of wet earth and pine. He was stiff, every muscle in his body a dull ache, but he was alive. He was warm. He looked across the hearth. Nayeli was awake. She hadn't moved from her spot, but her eyes were open, fixed on the dying fire. She looked different in the morning light. The harsh, defensive angles of her face seemed softened, and the deep, abiding sorrow in her eyes was more pronounced without the dancing shadows of the fire to hide it. She looked younger, more vulnerable, and the sight stirred something protective in him that was fierce and unfamiliar. He pushed the blanket off and rose, moving with a quietness learned from years of not wanting to spook a nervous horse. Her head turned at the movement, her body instantly tensing. The knife was still on the hearth beside her, and her eyes flickered to it, a reflexive check for her only ally. He saw the movement and stopped, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. "The storm's passed," he said, his voice a low rasp in the morning quiet. She nodded, her gaze cautious. The fragile bridge they had built in the darkness of the night felt precarious in the light of day. The rules of her world, her solitude, were reasserting themselves. He was a man, a stranger, and the time for him to leave was approaching. He needed to break the renewed tension. He needed to find a piece of the common ground they had discovered. He walked to his saddlebags, his boots making soft sounds on the floor. He rummaged inside and pulled out his small, battered coffee pot and a tin of coffee grounds. It was a ritual as familiar to him as saddling his horse, a small piece of civilization he carried with him everywhere. He went to the hearth, moving slowly so she could see his intent. He took the pot, dipped it into the water bucket near the door, and set it on the embers, pushing them together to create a small pocket of heat. Then he added the grounds. The aroma, rich and dark and bitter, began to fill the small cabin. It was the smell of 1,000 lonely campfires, the smell of his life. But here, in her world of wild herbs and wood smoke, it was an alien scent. He saw her watching the pot, her expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. It was likely a smell she had only ever encountered from a distance, from the camps of men she had learned to avoid. When the coffee was ready, he poured the dark liquid into his single tin mug. He hesitated for a moment, then looked around the cabin. On one of the shelves was a simple wooden cup. It looked like she had carved it herself. He took it down, his actions deliberate. He poured half of the coffee from his mug into her cup. He walked over to her and held it out. She stared at the cup, not at him. She didn't move. It was another offering, another intrusion of his world into hers. He waited patiently, his arm outstretched. After a long moment, she slowly reached out and took it from him. Her fingers were careful not to touch his, but the simple act of accepting the cup was a monumental concession. He retreated to his side of the fire and sat down, cradling his own warm mug. He watched her over the rim as he took a sip. She held the cup in both hands, as if to draw warmth from it. She raised it to her lips, hesitated, then took a small, tentative taste. Her eyes widened slightly at the unfamiliar bitterness, and a small frown creased her brow. She was a woman who knew the taste of every root and leaf in this canyon, but the taste of this common bean was a mystery. "It's an acquired taste," he said softly. She took another, longer sip. Considering it, "It is the drink of your people," she stated, her voice quiet. "It makes them talk loud and move fast." "Sometimes," he admitted, "for me, It just makes the morning feel a little less cold." They drank in silence for a while. The simple, shared act a strange and potent form of communication. The sun was rising now, and a single, brilliant shaft of golden light pierced through the window, cutting through the gloom and illuminating a swirling cloud of dust motes. The world outside was coming back to life. "The trail will be a mess," he said, more to himself than to her. "A river of mud. It'll be slow going." The words were a reminder. His departure was not a question of if, but when. He saw a flicker of something in her expression, a shadow that passed through her eyes. He couldn't name it. It wasn't fear or anger. It was something closer to loss. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. In the space of a single night, his presence, which had begun as a terrifying intrusion, had become a buffer against her profound and absolute loneliness. And now that buffer was about to be removed. "The settlement," she said, her voice barely audible, her eyes on the beam of light. "Willow Creek. What is it like?" "Just a place," he said, shrugging. "A main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a few houses, a church with a crooked steeple, full of people, families." He said the last word without thinking, but he felt the impact of it on her as soon as it left his lips. Families. The word represented everything she did not have, everything she had been denied. "People," she repeated, the word tasting strange on her tongue. "They find each other. They talk. They touch hands. They are not afraid." "Oh, they're afraid," he countered gently. "They're afraid of drought, of sickness, of losing what they have. Most of all, I think they're afraid of being alone." He looked at her, and his heart clenched. He had just described the one fear she had been forced to live with every single day of her life. She was the living embodiment of what all those people in Willow Creek dreaded most. She set her cup down on the hearth, her movements slow and deliberate. The fire was little more than a pile of gray ash now, with a few stubborn red sparks glowing deep within. The cabin was growing cold. "I have watched them sometimes," she whispered, her voice so low he had to lean forward to hear. "From the ridges. Years ago, the children, they would run and laugh. Sometimes, a mother would catch one of them and put her lips on the child's face." He knew what she was describing. A kiss, the simplest, most common expression of affection. "It is a strange custom," she continued, her gaze lost in the past, "to press your mouth to another." A deep, painful silence settled over the cabin. Sterling felt like he was standing on sacred ground, that he was trespassing in the most private chamber of her heart. He didn't know what to say. Every word he could think of seemed clumsy and inadequate. At last she turned and met his gaze. The defenses in her eyes had fallen, leaving a naked, aching fragility that was almost painful to witness. He saw a deep reservoir of human yearning, a hunger left unfed for an entire lifetime. "No one has ever done that to me," she said, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "No one ever kissed me." The words, so simple, so plain, landed in the quiet room with the force of a thunderclap. Sterling's breath caught in his throat. He could not speak. He could only stare at her, at the quiet devastation in her eyes. It was not a plea for pity. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact, a stark and brutal summary of her entire existence. She was a woman grown, yet she had never known the most basic human touch of affection. She had been treated as something other, something untouchable, for so long that she had been denied the very experiences that defined a human life. His mind reeled. He thought of the casual affections of the world he knew, the quick pecks on the cheek between family, the stolen kisses behind a barn, the rough embraces of the saloon girls. They were a currency of life he had never even thought to count. And this woman, this strong, resilient, beautiful woman, had a fortune of them owed to her. He didn't know how to respond. A part of him, the cynical, trail-hardened cowboy, was wary. Was this a trick? A strange, desperate kind of proposition from a lonely woman. But then he looked at her face, at the utter lack of artifice, at the tremor of her lips she was trying to control, at the profound shame and courage it took for her to admit such a thing to a stranger. And in that moment, he understood. This was not a moment of weakness. It was a moment of impossible strength. It was the ultimate act of trust. She had looked at him, the man who had invaded her home, a representative of the world that had brutalized and abandoned her, and she had decided he was worthy of her most painful, most secret truth. She was not asking for a lover. She was not asking for a savior. She was asking for a witness. She was asking, in the only way she knew how, to be touched not as a curse or an object or an outcast, but as a human being. It was a plea to be allowed, just for a moment, to be a part of the world that had always kept her on the other side of the glass. He felt the weight of her confession settle onto his shoulders. It was a heavier burden than any saddle, more precious than any gold. What she was offering him was a piece of her soul, wounded and untarnished. The choice of what to do with it was his, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that it would be the most important choice he had ever made. The space between them was taut with unspoken words, with the weight of a life's worth of loneliness laid bare. Sterling stood on the precipice of a response, a gesture, something to acknowledge the profound trust Nayeli had placed in him. The air was still, sacred. He saw not a curse, but a woman who had been denied the very essence of human warmth. He took a half step forward, his calloused hand lifting, not knowing what he intended to do, only that he had to close the chasm of her isolation, even by an inch. And in that instant, the sanctuary was shattered. It began as a distant sound, a discordant noise that did not belong to the clean, post-storm world. It was a chaotic rhythm of hoofbeats, too many, and the rough, ugly sound of men's voices raised not in conversation, but in a drunken, aggressive cheer. Nayeli heard it at the same moment he did. Her transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The vulnerable woman with the haunted eyes vanished, and in her place was the cornered animal from the night before. Her body went rigid, her head snapping up, her gaze darting to the door. She moved with a silent, desperate speed, snatching the knife from the hearth and retreating to the darkest corner of the cabin. Melting into the shadows, the wall of ice was back, thicker and more absolute than ever. The sounds grew louder, closer. They were coming up the narrow entrance to the box canyon. Sterling's blood ran cold. This was not a chance encounter. They were coming here, for her. "Stay back," he commanded in a low, urgent whisper, his own hand moving instinctively to his hip where his gun should have been. It was still by the door with his saddle. A rookie mistake, born of the night's strange intimacy. Heavy, clumsy footsteps thudded on the muddy ground outside, followed by a loud, brutish bang on the red door that made the entire cabin shudder. "Witch," a voice slurred from the other side, thick with cheap whiskey and malice. "We know you're in there, come on out, witch." Another voice, younger and higher pitched, joined in. "Jebediah says you've been putting ideas in our women's heads, making them contrary." Sterling moved swiftly to the small, grimy window, peering through a clear patch in the glass. He saw 4 men. They were disheveled, their faces flushed with drink and a righteous fury. They looked like they had come straight from the settlement saloon. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard and a blacksmith's shoulders, held a half-empty bottle in one hand. This had to be Jebediah. He was the eye of their small, hateful storm. "My Mary ain't been right for a week," Jebediah bellowed, taking a swig from the bottle. "Been looking at me with a sour face. Talking back. Says a woman has a right to her own thoughts. She ain't never talked like that before. It's you. You've been working your devilry from up here." It was insane. The ignorant, superstitious ramblings of a drunkard whose wife was likely just tired of his foolishness. But the conviction in their voices was real. They had found a target for their frustrations, a simple answer to their complicated problems. They had found a witch to burn, Another bang rattled the door. Harder this time. "Come out, or we're coming in." Sterling looked back at Nayeli. She was pressed against the far wall, her knuckles white where she gripped her knife. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen her breath. This was not a new fear for her. This was an old nightmare, returned. This was the face of the world she had spent her life hiding from. In that moment, a cold, clear rage settled over Sterling. The men outside were not just a threat to Nayeli. They were a desecration of the fragile, sacred moment that had just passed between them. They were the embodiment of the ignorance and cruelty that had put her in this corner, that had stolen her life from her. He had a choice. He was a stranger, a passerby. He could stay quiet, hide in another corner. He could wait for them to break down the door and then try to reason with them. Explain he was just a traveler caught in the storm. They might listen, they might not. But as he looked at Nayeli, at the utter desolation on her face, he knew he couldn't. To remain silent would be to side with them. It would be to agree that she was something to be feared, something less than human. The man who had sat by her fire, who had listened to her story, who had seen the aching want in her soul, could not do that. The ghosts of his own past, of his failure to be there for his brother, whispered a warning. "You don't walk away this time." He strode to the door and grabbed his gun belt, strapping it on with swift, economical movements. The familiar weight of the Colt settling on his hip was a comfort, a solid piece of reality in a world gone mad. He checked the action, the metallic click a sharp, definitive sound in the tense silence of the cabin. He turned to Nayeli. "Stay away from the door," he said, his voice low but firm. "Don't make a sound." Her eyes, wide with fear, were locked on him. She didn't seem to understand. Why was he doing this? Why was he putting himself between her and the hate-filled world? He gave her no more time to wonder. He took a deep breath, slid the heavy bar from the door, and pulled it open. He stepped out onto the muddy ground, pulling the door shut behind him. Positioning himself squarely in front of it, he stood between them and her, a solitary, unmovable object. The four men fell silent, their drunken jeers dying in their throats. They had not expected this. They had expected a frightened, solitary woman. They had not expected a tall, grim-faced cowboy with a Colt revolver strapped to his hip and a look in his eyes that was colder than the morning air. Sterling let the silence stretch, his gaze moving slowly from one man to the next. He sized them up. The leader, Jebediah, was big and full of bluster. The other three were followers, their courage borrowed from the bottle and their leader's rage. "That's far enough," Sterling said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that cut through the whiskey haze. Jebediah blinked, then scowled, his drunken bravado returning. "Who in the hell are you? Get out of the way. We've got business with the witch." "This cabin and the person in it are under my protection," Sterling stated, his tone flat and non-negotiable. "Your business is with me." One of the younger men, a lanky kid named Barton, laughed nervously. "Protection, what's she to you? Mister, you, one of her customers." Sterling's eyes narrowed. "And the kid's laugh died." "I'm a man who got caught in the storm last night. She gave me shelter. That's more courtesy than you're showing. Now, I suggest you and your friends get on your horses and ride back to whatever saloon you crawled out of before you make a mistake you'll regret." Jebediah took a belligerent step forward, puffing out his chest. "We ain't going nowhere. That thing in there, she's a plague. My life's been nothing but trouble since she set herself up here. My cattle sickened last spring. My boy broke his leg. Now my wife's turned against me. It's her," she whispers on the wind. "Your wife's turned against you because you're a fool who'd rather blame a lonely woman for your problems than look in a mirror," Sterling shot back, his voice like cracking ice. "Your cattle got sick because of bad water, and your boy broke his leg because he's a boy. You want to find the source of your troubles. Jebediah, go home and look at the man who holds the bottle." The truth in his words hit the big man like a physical blow. Jebediah's face contorted with rage. He was not used to being challenged. "You're talking mighty big for a stranger," he snarled, his hand drifting toward the hunting knife on his belt. "Maybe she's put her spell on you, too. The only spell here is the one whiskey casts on weak-minded men," Sterling said, not taking his eyes off Jebediah. "You've come here to bully a woman who has no one to defend her. You call that courage, 4 of you against 1. It's pathetic." His words were aimed to shame the others, to separate them from their leader. He saw a flicker of doubt in the eyes of the 2 younger men, Caleb and Barton. They were followers, caught up in something they hadn't fully thought through. But Elias, the 4th man, was older and meaner. "She ain't just a woman," he spat. "She's Apache. That's reason enough." "That's no reason at all," Sterling replied, his voice dangerously low. "I'm telling you for the last time, mount up and ride out." Jebediah made his decision. He was too drunk, too angry, and too committed to back down now. He would lose face in front of his friends. "The hell with you," he roared, and lunged. He wasn't trying to attack Sterling directly. His goal was the door. He shoved past Sterling, his big shoulder catching him off balance, and reached for the handle. He never made it. Sterling moved with a speed that was startling. He sidestepped, brought the barrel of his Colt up in a short, brutal arc, and slammed it against the side of Jebediah's head. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was delivered with the full force of his arm. The sound was a sickening thud of metal against bone. Jebediah grunted, his eyes rolling back in his head, and collapsed into the mud like a felled ox, unconscious. The other 3 froze, their jaws slack with shock. The scene had exploded from a drunken confrontation into deadly serious violence in a heartbeat. Sterling turned to face them. The Colt now held steady in his hand, its dark muzzle looking as big as a tunnel. His face was a mask of cold fury. "I said," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper but more menacing than any shout. "Your business here is done." Barton and Caleb took a stumbling step back, their hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The whiskey had evaporated from their veins, replaced by a cold, sober fear. They wanted no part of this. But Elias, his face a knot of hate, slowly reached for the pistol tucked into his belt. "Don't," Sterling warned, his aim shifting to the man's chest. For a long, tense second, no one moved. The only sounds were the dripping of water and Jebediah's ragged snores from the mud. Elias's eyes darted from Sterling's gun to his unconscious friend and back again. He was calculating his chances. Sterling didn't give him time to finish the math. "You came here looking for a witch," he said, his voice resonating with a chilling certainty. "But you made a mistake. You found me instead, and I promise you, I am far more real than any story you've ever told yourselves. Now get your friend and get out of this canyon. If I ever see any of you near this cabin again, the conversation will be much shorter." He punctuated the last word with a slight, deliberate cocking of his pistol's hammer. The sharp, metallic click was as final as a nail being driven into a coffin lid. That was enough. Elias's hand dropped from his gun. The fight was gone from him, replaced by a sullen, hateful compliance. He and the other 2 hoisted Jebediah's limp form from the mud, grunting with the effort, and began dragging him back toward their horses, their eyes never leaving the unwavering muzzle of Sterling's Colt. The siege was broken. The world had come to Nayeli's door, and for the first time in her life, it had been turned away. Sterling stood over the unconscious form of Jebediah, the Colt still steady in his hand, its cold metal a stark contrast to the hot, pulsing anger in his veins. He watched as the other 3 men, their drunken courage utterly broken, hauled their leader's dead weight toward their horses. Their movements were clumsy, panicked, their backward glances filled with a raw, sober fear. They were no longer a mob. They were just 3 chastened fools, desperate to escape the consequences of their own ignorance. The silence that descended upon the small canyon was more unnerving than the shouting had been. It was a vacuum, filled only by the dripping of water from the rocks and the labored, wheezing breaths of the man in the mud. Sterling did not lower the gun. He knew their kind. Their fear would curdle back into hate by the time they reached the saloon. This wasn't over. He was a single man against a settlement's worth of festering resentment. He had bought Nayeli a few hours, perhaps a day, but he had also painted a target on her door, and on himself. He was about to turn, to go back inside and face the terrified woman he had just violently defended, when a movement at the mouth of the canyon caught his eye. His body went rigid, his aim snapping instantly toward the new threat. But these were not more drunken settlers. 5 figures emerged from the main canyon trail, stepping into the muddy clearing. They moved not with a stagger, but with a silent, deliberate grace that spoke of a deep familiarity with the land. They were women, clad in buckskin dresses, their black hair braided with sinew and beads. They carried no rifles, only a profound and unnerving stillness. They were Apache. The retreating settlers saw them at the same time. A fresh wave of panic washed over their faces. To them, this could only be an ambush, a retribution. Elias fumbled for his pistol again, his face a mask of terror. But the women ignored them. Their focus was entirely on the cabin, on the man with the gun standing before the red door. They fanned out in a silent line, creating a human barrier between the settlers and the cabin. Their faces were impassive, carved from stone, their dark eyes holding a collective weight that made the settlers' drunken rage seem childish and petty. The leader of the group, a woman a generation older than the others, took a single step forward. She was tall and carried herself with an unshakable dignity. Her face was a map of hardship and sorrow, her skin weathered like old leather. But her eyes were what stopped Sterling's breath. They were the same color as Nayeli's, the same deep, sorrowful shade of wet earth, and they were fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to look right through his flesh and into his soul. Under that silent, powerful gaze, Elias and the others gave up completely. They scrambled onto their horses, dragging Jebediah's limp body across a saddle, and kicked their mounts into a panicked, slipping gallop, fleeing the canyon as if the devil himself were at their heels. Sterling, slowly, cautiously, lowered his gun. He did not holster it. These women were not a threat in the way the settlers had been, but he did not understand their purpose. Their arrival at this exact moment was too perfect to be a coincidence. The older woman's gaze shifted from him to the red door of the cabin. A deep, profound pain entered her expression, a crack in the stoic mask. She took another step forward, and then another, her movement slow, hesitant, as if she were approaching a sacred place she had no right to enter. Behind him, Sterling heard the faint creak of the door opening. He turned his head. Nayeli stood in the doorway. She had seen the settlers flee, but now she saw the new arrivals. The knife was still in her hand, held in a white-knuckled grip. Her body was a single taut line of defiance, ready to fight the next wave of intruders. Then her eyes met those of the older woman. A sound tore from Nayeli's throat, a raw, choked gasp that was part disbelief, part agony. The knife slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered onto the stone step. Her face, which had been a mask of feral defiance, crumbled. Every defense she had ever built, every wall of ice and stone, shattered in that instant of recognition. "Shema," she whispered, the Apache word for mother a ghost on her lips. Sterling stepped back, holstering his pistol, understanding with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that he was now the intruder. He was a stranger who had stumbled into the final, agonizing act of a tragedy that had begun decades ago. The space between the woman and the girl was charged with a history so dense and painful it was almost a physical presence. The older woman, her eyes now shimmering with unshed tears, continued her slow advance. When she was only a few feet from the step, she stopped. "Nayeli," she said, and the name was a prayer, a lament, a confession. "My daughter." Nayeli flinched as if struck. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking, thick with the unshed tears of 1,000 lonely nights. "Why are you here?" "We heard," her mother said, her voice rough with emotion. "A hunter from our camp saw the white men riding toward the canyon. He saw their faces, heard their drunken shouts. He said they came for the woman of the red door. And you came to watch." Nayeli's voice was laced with the bitterness of a lifetime of abandonment. "To see them finish the work you started." Her mother visibly recoiled, the accusation a physical blow. "No," she said, shaking her head, the tears finally breaking free and tracing paths through the weathered lines of her face. "No, I came to stop them. I came because my cowardice has ended." She looked at her own hands, then back at her daughter. "There has not been a day, not a single sunrise since we left you here, that my spirit has not been in this canyon with you. I left my child to the mercy of the rocks and the wind, and in doing so, I left my own heart here to turn to stone." The other women stood behind her, silent witnesses, their faces etched with a shared sorrow and shame. Then Nayeli cried out, the question a raw wound. "You were my mother. You let them cast me out. You said nothing, you turned your back, and you walked away." "Fear," her mother answered, the word a self-loathing hiss. "I was afraid, not of you. I was afraid of what you could do, of what I did not understand. You were a quiet child, but your eyes saw everything. You saw the truth in people, the secrets they kept buried. You saw the good, but you also saw the rot, and it frightened them. It frightened me." She took another step, her hand rising as if to touch her daughter's face, but she let it fall, not daring to cross that final distance. "The warrior, the one who first called you a curse. I knew he was lying. I saw the shame in his own eyes, but he was a powerful man, and the people were afraid. It was a hard winter, game was scarce. They needed something to blame. I was weak. I let their fear become my own. I thought if you were away from them, you would be safe, that their fear could not touch you here. I told myself it was a kindness, a way to protect you." Her voice broke, and a sob escaped her. "It was a lie. I was protecting myself. From the shame, from the anger of the tribe, from my own terror at having a daughter who could see into the soul of the world. I chose my people over my own blood. It was a cowardice that will be my shame in this life and the next." Nayeli stood trembling, the tears streaming down her face, washing away the years of dust and solitude. She was listening to the confession she had both longed for and dreaded for her entire life. Every word was a balm on her wounded soul, and every word was a fresh cut, reminding her of all the years she had suffered because of that fear. Her mother looked at her, her eyes pleading, stripped of all pride, of all authority. She was no longer a stoic Apache elder. She was just a mother, begging for the forgiveness of the child she had wronged. "We have been wrong, Nayeli," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Our people have been diminished by your absence. We lost a part of our heart when we cast you out. The world has changed. The white man pushes in, and we grow weaker by fighting ourselves. We need your strength. We need your sight. I need my daughter. Please, come home." "Come home." The words hung in the clean morning air. It was an invitation Nayeli had never, in her wildest, most desperate dreams, believed she would ever hear. She looked from her mother's tear-streaked face to the silent, solemn women behind her. She looked at the cabin, her prison and her sanctuary. She looked at Sterling, the stranger who had defended her, the man who had shown her a kindness she had forgotten existed. Her entire world, once so small and contained, had been ripped open. All the strength that had held her together for so long, the anger, the pride, the sheer, stubborn will to survive finally gave way. A sound tore from her throat. Not a word, but the raw, unshaped sound of a lifetime of pain being released. Her legs buckled. Her mother surged forward, closing the final distance in a single step. Nayeli did not walk into her mother's arms. She collapsed. She fell forward, and her mother caught her, wrapping her arms around her daughter's trembling body, holding her tight. Nayeli buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her hands clutching at the worn buckskin, and she began to sob. It was not the quiet, lonely weeping of her solitary nights. It was a storm of grief, a flood of anguish for the lost years, for the lost girlhood, for the mother she thought she would never know again. Her mother held her, rocking her gently, murmuring soft, soothing words in the Apache tongue, her own tears falling into her daughter's hair. The other women drew closer, forming a protective circle around them, their faces no longer stoic, but filled with a shared, profound emotion. Sterling stood apart, a silent, solitary witness to the raw, painful, beautiful moment of healing. He was the catalyst. His arrival, the storm, the fight. It had all been the stone that started the avalanche. But this moment, this sacred reunion, did not belong to him. He watched as Nayeli, the woman of the red door, the curse of the canyon, was finally, after a lifetime of exile, welcomed home. The world slowly came back into focus, the sharp edges of the canyon softening. Sterling felt like a man who had woken from a fever dream. The raw, elemental drama of the last hour, the drunken fury, the sudden violence, the impossible reunion left him feeling hollowed out, a spectator in a story far older and deeper than his own. He stood by the cold hearth, an island of stillness in the quiet storm of emotion that had engulfed the small clearing. Nayeli was no longer his to protect. She was surrounded by her own people, by the women who had come for her. He watched as her mother, whose name he learned was Iyari, gently led her to a large, flat rock near the cabin wall, away from the mud and the lingering ghost of the confrontation. They sat, and Iyari began to speak in the soft, flowing cadence of the Apache tongue, her hands stroking her daughter's hair, her touch trying to mend the wounds of 1,000 lonely days. The other women kept a respectful distance, their presence a silent, supportive wall. Sterling knew he should leave. His part in this was over. He was a foreign element, a piece of a different world that had no place here. His horse, Dust, was waiting, and the trail to Willow Creek was long, yet his feet felt rooted to the ground. To leave now felt like walking away in the middle of a church service, like turning his back on something sacred and profound. After some time, Iyari rose and approached him. Her face was still marked by tears, but a quiet strength had returned to her eyes. She stopped a few feet from him, her gaze direct and assessing. She was seeing him now, not just as a man with a gun, but as the man who had stood before her daughter's door. "She told me your name is Sterling," Iyari said, her English as precise as Nayeli's, but with a deeper, more resonant timbre. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "You did not have to do what you did," she said. "It was not a question. Those men, their hearts are full of bad water. You could have been killed. You are not her kin. You are not her people." "Why?" Sterling looked past her, to where Nayeli sat watching them, her expression unreadable. "Because no one should have to face that kind of hate alone," he answered, his voice low. "And because your daughter showed me kindness when I needed it." Iyari held his gaze, and he felt that strange, piercing quality of sight that he had felt from Nayeli, the feeling of being seen, truly seen, down to the bedrock of his soul. He had the unsettling feeling that this woman knew about his brother, about his own lonely trail, without him having said a word. "You have a strong spirit," she said, a quiet statement of fact. "It is not clouded. You have given my daughter a great gift today, not just her safety, but proof that not all men of your people are like them." She gave a slight nod toward the path the settlers had fled. "For this, we are in your debt." "There is no debt, ma'am," he said. He gathered his things, his movements feeling slow and heavy. He picked up his coffee pot and his bedroll, his hands feeling clumsy and awkward. He walked to the door and picked up his saddle. The weight of it was a familiar burden, a reminder of the life that was waiting for him, a life of endless horizons and profound solitude. He turned to leave. He gave a final nod to Iyari, a silent farewell. He did not want to look at Nayeli. To look at her would be to acknowledge the sharp, painful pull he felt in his chest. A feeling he had no name for, a feeling he knew he had no right to. "Wait." Her voice, though quiet, cut through the air and stopped him in his tracks. He turned. Nayeli had risen and was walking toward him, leaving the circle of her family. She moved with a newfound confidence, a straightness in her back that had not been there before. The reunion had not just healed a wound. It had begun to restore a part of her that had been in exile even longer than her body. She stopped in front of him, so close he could see the individual flecks of gold in her dark, earth-colored eyes. "You are leaving," she said. "The trail is waiting," he confirmed, his own voice sounding rougher than he intended. "Yes," she said, a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "It is." They stood in silence for a moment, the world shrinking until it was only the few feet of muddy ground that separated them. In her eyes, he saw the question, the impossible choice that now lay before her. "Your mother, she asked you to go with them," he said, stating the obvious. "Yes, to come home." She said the last word as if it were a foreign country she was only just learning the geography of. "And you will," he said. It wasn't a question. It was what was right. It was the end her story deserved. A new beginning. "I will," she confirmed. But her eyes held his, and in their depths, he saw the conflict, the tearing of her soul. She had been given back her past, her family, her world. But in the space of a single stormy night, he had appeared and shown her a glimpse of a different kind of future, a different kind of connection, a connection that was just as impossible as her return had seemed only yesterday. He knew what she was thinking, because the same impossible thoughts were running through his own mind. The insane idea of asking her to come with him, to trade her canyon for his endless prairie, her newfound family for his crushing loneliness. He could see it, a fleeting, sun-drenched image of her riding beside him, her black hair flying in the wind. But it was a fool's dream, and they both knew it. He saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, the same sad, practical truth that had settled in his own heart. "You cannot stay here," she said softly, giving voice to the truth. "This is not your world. You would not survive it. You would become another outcast." "And you cannot come with me," he countered, his own voice laced with a regret so sharp it was a physical pain. "The world I live in, it is the world that sent those men to your door. It is not a kind place for your people. It would not see you, Nayeli. It would only see an Apache. It would crush you." They had arrived at the same bitter, unavoidable conclusion. Their paths had crossed in a violent, miraculous convergence. But they could not merge. They were two different rivers, destined to flow in two different directions. This was goodbye. The realization settled between them, heavy and final. All the words they could say had been said. All that was left was the parting. He gave her a small, sad smile and began to turn away, to walk toward his horse and the lonely life that awaited him. "Sterling," she said, her voice stopping him one last time. He turned back. Her face was a mask of fierce resolve, a burning intensity in her eyes that he had not seen before. She was no longer just the victim, the outcast, the survivor. She was a woman, taking control of her own story, of her own heart. "Before you go," she began, her voice low and steady, though he could see the slight tremor in her hands. "There is one thing, one last thing." He waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. She took a deep, shuddering breath, gathering all the courage she possessed, a courage that had seen her through years of unimaginable hardship. She was about to make herself more vulnerable than she had been when facing down Jebediah's mob. "You told me of your world," she said, "of families, of the things people do, the custom of pressing your mouth to another." He stared at her, his mind refusing to believe what she was about to ask. "I have my family back," she said, her voice trembling slightly but her gaze unwavering. "They will teach me how to live among our people again. I will have a home, but I will live my whole life in that home, and I will die there. And there is a part of the world, a part of what it means to be a person, that I will have never known." Her eyes bored into his, pleading, demanding, trusting. "Kiss me," she said, the words a raw, desperate whisper. "Please, do not let me go back to my life without knowing that feeling. Let my first memory of it be one of kindness, not something else." She was not asking for love. She was not asking for passion. She was asking for a piece of her own stolen humanity. She was asking him to give her a memory that was not colored by fear or loneliness. She was asking him to take the ugliest part of her story, her profound, absolute isolation, and transform its ending into something beautiful. Sterling was thunderstruck. Every instinct he had screamed at the impossibility, the intimacy, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of her request. He was a rough man, a cowboy. His own experiences with kissing were fleeting, clumsy, and largely forgettable encounters in dusty towns. He was not a man of tenderness. But he looked at her, at the fierce pride warring with a desperate plea in her eyes, and he understood. This was not about him. It was not about desire. It was about her. It was about giving her a gift that no one else in the world could give her in this moment. It was the final act of seeing her, not as an Apache, not as a curse, but as Nayeli, a woman who deserved to know what it felt like to be touched with simple, human affection. His hesitation was not one of reluctance, but of reverence. He felt the crushing weight of the responsibility. To be the first, to craft a memory that she would carry with her for the rest of her days. He had to get it right. He slowly, deliberately, closed the remaining distance between them. He stopped just a breath away from her, so close he could see the sunlight on her eyelashes, the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. "Nayeli," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. He reached out, not with a cowboy's rough grasp, but with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. He slowly raised his hand, and with the backs of his fingers, he lightly, so lightly, brushed the stray piece of hair from her cheek. She flinched, a sharp intake of breath, but she did not pull away. She held her ground. She trusted him. And in that moment of fragile, impossible trust, he knew he would do as she asked. Time seemed to warp and bend, the ordinary rhythm of the world falling away. The canyon, her mother, the pale morning sun, all of it receded into a soft, indistinct blur. The only reality was the small, charged space between them, the quiet intensity in Sterling's eyes, and the gentle, revolutionary touch of his fingers against her skin. Nayeli had spent her life observing the world from a distance, a watcher on the ridge. Now, for the first time, she was at the very center of a moment, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. Sterling's gaze held hers, and in it, she saw none of the things she had come to expect from men: no hunger, no pity, no contempt. She saw only a profound and solemn respect, a deep understanding of the weight of her request. He was not just looking at her, he was seeing her, the woman who had been invisible for so long. He saw her courage, and he was honoring it. He leaned in, his movement not a swift advance, but a slow, deliberate drift, giving her every chance to retreat, to change her mind. His other hand came up to gently cup the other side of her face, his thumbs resting on her cheekbones, tilting her head slightly upward. The touch was firm, but incredibly gentle, a gesture of reverence. It anchored her, held her steady in the dizzying current of emotion that was sweeping through her. She closed her eyes, a final, complete surrender of trust. She was giving him not just her first kiss, but the entirety of her vulnerability. His breath was warm against her face, smelling faintly of coffee and the clean morning air. She felt the slight, rough texture of his calloused thumbs as they stroked her skin, a touch that spoke of hard work and a hard life, yet was now the gentlest thing she had ever known. This, she thought, this alone was a revelation to be touched with such care. Then, his lips met hers, It was not a collision, but a whisper, a soft, tentative pressure, as light as a moth's wing. It was a question asked in a language her body had never known, but her soul instantly understood. For a breathless second, that was all it was, a simple, chaste meeting, a silent acknowledgement. Her mind, so long her only companion, went completely still. There were no thoughts, no fears, only this new and overwhelming sensation. It was warmth, a deep, spreading warmth that started on her lips and radiated through her entire being, chasing away a cold that had been lodged in her bones for a lifetime. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with a fire and everything to do with a shared humanity. A small, involuntary sigh escaped her, and she felt herself lean into him. A fractional movement, but a response nonetheless. It was an answer to his unspoken question. Yes. He seemed to understand. The pressure of his mouth deepened slightly, becoming more firm, more certain. It was no longer a question, but a statement. It spoke of comfort, of solace, of a quiet, powerful recognition. It was a kiss that held the entire story of their stormy night, the shared shelter, the whispered confessions, the stand against the world. It was a kiss that tasted of rain-washed earth and second chances. Nayeli's hands, which had been clenched into fists at her sides, slowly uncurled. She raised them, hesitating for a moment, then rested them tentatively on his forearms. She felt the solid, living muscle beneath his worn shirt, and the reality of him, of this moment, became even more potent. He was real. This was real. For Sterling, this was uncharted territory. He had kissed women before, in hasty, forgettable encounters fueled by whiskey and loneliness. But this was different. This was like praying. He was acutely aware of the fragility of the moment, of the precious, untarnished gift she had given him. He poured every ounce of respect, every bit of the fierce, protective tenderness he felt for her, into the simple meeting of their lips. He was trying to communicate without words what he could never say, that he saw her strength, that he honored her survival, that in his eyes, she was not a curse, but a wonder. He was trying to give her a memory so pure it could act as a shield against all the ugly ones. It was a silent conversation, a perfect and complete exchange that lasted only a moment but held the weight of years. It was a bridge across the chasm that separated their two worlds, a brief, beautiful shelter from the harsh realities that were waiting to reclaim them. Slowly, reluctantly, he drew back. He ended the kiss with the same reverence with which he had begun it, his hands lingering on her face for a second longer, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks one last time. He pulled away, and the world rushed back in the sound of dripping water, the cool morning air on her skin, the silent, watchful presence of her mother and the other women. Nayeli opened her eyes. The canyon looked the same, the rocks and the pines unchanged, but everything was different. The colors seemed sharper, the air felt lighter. A single, perfect tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming release. She raised a trembling hand to her lips, as if to capture the lingering warmth, the memory that was now hers forever. She looked up at Sterling, and her eyes were shining with a light he had not seen before. The deep, haunted sorrow was still there, a shadow in the depths. But now it was overlaid with something new, something luminous. It was wonder. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice husky with emotion. He simply nodded, his own throat too tight for words. He felt humbled, shaken to his core. He had intended to give her a gift, but he felt as though he was the one who had received something priceless and irreplaceable. "When I was a girl," she continued, her gaze direct, her voice gaining strength, "I watched a hawk build its nest, piece by piece, a twig here, a piece of sinew there. It took so long. It was creating a place of its own." She paused, her eyes searching his. "My life has been gathering stones to build a wall, but this, what you just did." She took a shaky breath. You did not take something from me. You gave me the first piece of a different kind of home. You gave me a memory that is clean. It is not something stolen in the dark or taken in anger. It is mine, and it is beautiful." He had no answer for that. There was nothing he could say that would not sound cheap or hollow in the face of her profound, poetic gratitude. He had given her a simple kiss, but she had transformed it into a foundation stone for a new life. He saw Iyari take a small step forward, a silent signal that it was time. The moment was over. He nodded again. A final, painful acknowledgement. This was the end of their story. He stepped back, breaking the intimate space between them. The distance felt like a physical wound. He turned without another word and walked to his horse. Every step was heavy, each one taking him further from the only place he had felt a true human connection in years. He untied Dust's reins, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of 1,000 departures. He checked the saddle, adjusted the cinch. His mind focused on the mundane tasks to keep from thinking, from feeling. He swung himself up into the saddle, the familiar creak of the leather a lonely sound in the quiet canyon. He gathered the reins, his horse eager to be moving after the long, cold night. He allowed himself one last look. Nayeli had not moved. She stood there, a solitary, resilient figure in front of the defiant red door. Her mother now standing just behind her, a hand on her daughter's shoulder. The other women were a silent chorus, witnesses to this strange and poignant farewell. Nayeli's eyes met his across the muddy clearing. There was no plea in them, no desperation, only a deep, quiet, and unending gratitude. In her gaze, he saw a promise that his gift would be cherished, and in his own. He hoped she saw the truth that he was leaving a part of himself behind in this canyon, a part he knew he would never get back. He raised his hand in a small, final salute. She raised hers in return. Then he turned Dust's head toward the mouth of the canyon and kicked him into a walk, the horse's hooves making sucking sounds in the thick mud. He did not look back. To look back would be to admit that he was leaving something he couldn't bear to lose. He rode out of the box canyon and back onto the main trail, the high rock walls closing behind him, hiding the cabin and the woman with the unforgettable eyes from his view. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the trail. The world was washed clean, bright and cold and achingly empty. The trail ahead was just as it had always been, a long, lonely ribbon of dirt and rock. But the man who rode it was not the same. He rode with the ghost of a kiss on his lips and the weight of a beautiful, impossible memory in his heart. A single, perfect ember of warmth to carry with him into the cold and solitary miles ahead. 3 months had passed. The blistering heat of summer had broken, its fury giving way to the golden, melancholic light of early autumn. The land was painted in shades of ochre and rust, and the air, especially at dawn, carried a crisp, clean chill that promised the coming cold. Sterling was on a long, slow cattle drive, pushing a herd of longhorns south from the high plains toward the winter pastures near the Brazos River. It was the life he knew, a life measured in miles and seasons, in the lowing of cattle and the vast, aching silence of the plains. But the silence was different now. Before, it had been a simple emptiness, a companion to his own solitude. Now, it was filled with the ghost of a memory, the memory of a red door, of a storm, of dark, sorrowful eyes that had seen the truth of him, the memory of a kiss that had been both a beginning and an end. The world, which had once seemed a straightforward and brutal place, now held a secret, a pocket of impossible tenderness that only he knew about. The other cowboys on the drive, a rough and ready crew of drifters and dreamers, had noticed the change in him. He had always been quiet, but his quietness now had a different quality. It was a deeper, more introspective silence. They would find him staring at the western horizon long after the sun had set, as if he could see something beyond the gathering darkness. He drank his coffee in the morning and performed his duties with the same grim efficiency as always. But there was a new stillness about him, a sense of a man who was waiting. They didn't know what for, and they knew better than to ask. Men in their line of work carried their pasts like a second saddle, and it was considered poor form to inquire about the weight of another man's burden. One evening, as the camp settled down for the night, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was Billy, a young kid from the ranch that owned the herd, sent out with fresh supplies and any mail that might have gathered. Mail was a rare and often unwelcome thing on the trail, usually bringing news of debt or death. Billy trotted into camp, his face beaming with the self-importance of a messenger. He dismounted and handed a sack of letters to the trail boss, who began calling out names. Sterling expected nothing. He had no one to write to him. His family was gone, and he had never stayed in one place long enough to forge the kind of ties that warranted a letter. "Maddox," the trail boss called out, his voice laced with surprise. "Got something for you, something strange." Sterling rose from his spot by the fire, a knot tightening in his gut. The trail boss held out not a letter, but a small, flat package wrapped in a piece of soft, smoked deerskin and tied with a leather thong. There was no name on it, no address, just the word Sterling, written in a careful, angular script that was clearly unpracticed. It had been left with the rancher, with instructions that it was for the quiet man who rode the buckskin horse. A hush fell over the cowboys near the fire. They all stared at the strange parcel. Sterling took it, his hand surprisingly steady. The deerskin was soft and supple to the touch. He could feel something flat and stiff inside. He turned and walked away from the firelight, away from the curious eyes, until he was alone in the deep blue twilight at the edge of the camp. With trembling fingers, he untied the thong. Inside the deerskin was a folded piece of coarse paper, the kind one might get from a trading post. He unfolded it carefully. The same angular script filled the page, written in a dark ink made from charcoal and berry juice. He knew, before he read a single word, that it was from her. His heart, a steady, reliable muscle he had long ignored, began to beat a wild, frantic rhythm against his ribs. He held the paper up to the fading light and began to read. Sterling. The trader, Silas, is a man who likes stories, for a small price. He also likes to carry them. I gave him this. I told him it was for a man who was good to his horse, and that it would find its way to you. I hope he was as honest with my package as he is with his tales. 3 moons have passed since the storm brought you to my door. The canyon is quiet now. The red door is gone. My mother, Iyari, said it was a color of defiance, but also a color of warning. She said my door should now be a color of welcome. It is blue, the color of the sky after the rain. I am with my people. It is not simple. Trust is not a rock you can pick up. It is a seed that grows slowly in the earth. Some of the elders still look at me with fear in their eyes. They remember the stories. They remember the girl who saw too much. But my mother stands beside me. Her belief in me is a shield. And the women who came with her that day, they are my friends. They are teaching me the songs I have forgotten. I am teaching them how to read the tracks of the white man's world. A skill they now see is as important as tracking a deer. They no longer see my sight as a curse. They are beginning to see it as a form of strength. They bring me the young girls, the ones whose spirits are still wild and unbent. I do not teach them to see the rot in others. I teach them to see the truth in themselves, and to not be afraid of it. I teach them that their heart is a canyon, and it is vast enough to hold both great sorrow and great joy. I teach them to be strong, not with a fist, but with a spirit that cannot be broken. I am giving them the kind of shield I never had. Sometimes, I walk to the ridge and I look west, to the open plains where you have gone. The world is much larger than I knew. My canyon was my home and my prison. You showed me that there was a world beyond my walls. I do not know if it is a better world, but it is bigger, and I am grateful to you for that. I have not forgotten the gift you gave me before you left. It is a memory I keep in a quiet place. It is the first stone in the foundation of my new life. It is clean. It is mine. I do not know the customs of your world. I do not know if this letter is a proper thing to do, but I felt that a silence should not be the end of our story. You were a kind man in a storm. Be safe on the long trail. Nayeli. Sterling read the letter once, his eyes devouring the words. Then he read it again, slowly, letting the meaning of each phrase sink into him like a gentle rain into dry earth. He could see her as she wrote it, her brow furrowed in concentration, her hand carefully forming each unfamiliar letter. He could hear her voice in the simple, profound sentences. Trust is a seed that grows slowly. My door is now the color of welcome, a spirit that cannot be broken. He had left her a woman shattered and then miraculously pieced back together. But the woman who wrote this letter was more than just whole. She was growing. She was taking the very thing that had made her an outcast and turning it into a source of power, a tool for teaching, a gift to her people. She was not just surviving. She was healing, and in healing herself, she was helping to heal the very tribe that had wounded her. He folded the letter with a reverence he would normally reserve for a sacred object. He traced the shape of her name, the letters that had once been alien to him and were now the most important word in his world. She had not spoken of love, not in the way the songs and poems did. She had not asked him to return, but the letter was more intimate than any declaration of love. It was a sharing of her soul. It was a quiet, steady flame of hope sent out across the miles, a message to let him know that the kindness he had shown in that canyon had not been forgotten, that it had taken root and was now bearing fruit. He stood there for a long time, the cool night air on his face, the deerskin-wrapped letter held in his hand. He looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky. The emptiness of the plains no longer felt like a burden. The loneliness he had carried for so many years, the hard shell he had built around his heart after his brother's death, began to crack. A feeling he had long since forgotten, a warmth that had nothing to do with a fire or whiskey, spread through his chest. It was hope, a real, quiet, and powerful hope. And for the first time in more years than he could count, Sterling Maddox smiled. It was not a grin, not a smirk. It was a slow, genuine curve of his lips, a smile that reached his weary eyes and filled them with a light that had long been absent. He carefully slipped the letter into the inner pocket of his worn jacket, the one closest to his heart. The trail ahead was still long. There were cattle to move, a job to finish. But for the first time, the trail did not feel endless. It no longer felt like an escape from the past. It now had a destination. He did not know when. He did not know how. But as he turned and walked back toward the distant, flickering light of the campfire, he knew with an absolute and unshakable certainty that his days of riding away were over. One day, he would turn his horse around, and he would ride west, back toward a canyon, back toward a door the color of the sky after a storm. He would ride home. Thank you for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to connect with you and hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.